So this is intended to be a very interactive presentation, so we really hope that you all will butt in, interrupt, ask questions, whatever you need to do to get what you want out of it. And as the intro indicated, we're going to tell you the components of a good crisis plan and help you kind of work through that a little bit. So first, what is a crisis? What constitutes a crisis? Or better yet, give me some examples of what a crisis is. Obviously, a data breach. What else? Oil spill. What else? Sorry? Virus. Sorry? Flooding. Absolutely. Yes, can be. Thank you. Active shooter. So every one of these crises is something that we've been involved in, and there are more and more and more and more. Yeah, we've handled piracy on the high seas. We've even handled a bank holdup. But in essence, what a crisis is anything that forces you into a reactive mode, anything that takes you away or any of your other precious resources away from successful day-to-day operations. It's a distraction for a significant period of time. A crisis is almost always, and then this is something that's certainly been true today about data breaches, something that could have been anticipated and planned for. So planning means having resources in place, which means being proactive, and we're going to talk about being proactive a fair amount, and ultimately having the smallest negative impact on your business. Can't tell you how often clients have said to us, "It's not my fault." It doesn't have to be your fault to be your problem. And I think a data breach is a perfect example. I mean, even if you have put everything in place you need to put in place, you can still have a data breach. So it's about perception in a lot of different ways. There's a direct correlation between how well you communicate during a crisis and how well you survive the crisis. Something that hasn't really been talked about today, and just to add another layer of paranoia for you, a crisis is really good for your competitors. They're going to be learning lessons from you, and they're going to be jumping in and trying to take advantage of you. So I'm seeing a big nod in the front row here, so somebody who's obviously experienced that on some level. So why does it matter whether or not you communicate? I would bet 90%, maybe more than 90% of people in this room are not in the communications business, and they're thinking, I need to be lining up my insurance, I need to be lining up my attorneys, I need to be managing my day-to-day business, I need to be doing a million different things. And that's part of what a crisis is. It just throws everything into such turmoil. The reason communication matters is for all the reasons that you're already thinking about. It's your overall liability. It really can, the right communication really can reduce your liability at the end of the day. That's why the insurance folks and the legal folks have been telling you to get PR, as part of an element. And I would argue that the speakers today have all been really carefully selected because we can all work hand in glove and make sure that you come through your crisis whole. Your reputation obviously is impacted by a crisis. Think about all of the case studies we've talked about today. Target, all of them. Employee morale and employee retention. If you're upended by a crisis, that's going to impact your good people, your growth, your stability, your customers' loyalty. A crisis is a phenomenal way to lose customers if you're not communicating with them directly and consistently and transparently. Your vendors and your investors, your bankers, and then just as importantly, and this is a bad omission on my part on this slide, the regulators you deal with on a day-to-day basis. Several of us have talked about incident command structures and systems, and we're all talking effectively about one system that works really, really well. It can be obviously adapted to any particular situation, but the concept of a responsible party is often used by regulators. And it's an expression that I think strikes fear in a lot of people's hearts, right? I'm responding to this thing, therefore I must be responsible, therefore going back to this is my fault. It doesn't have to convey guilt. You can step up to the plate and deal with a crisis and manage the guilt side completely separately. And that's why, again, you need really, really good attorneys dealing with your crisis. Most crises that deal with regulators are going to involve an independent investigation anyway. So guilt is not being established because you've stepped up to the plate to manage the crisis. So you do need to step up to the plate if you've got stakeholders that might be impacted. And we can all think of various different examples of situations where something has caused a crisis that was not the original company's fault, but they had to jump in and deal with it. And I can't think of a better one than a data breach. So that's a really, really good focus from today. And then, newsflash, media doesn't always get it right. So if your crisis becomes public, there are a lot of stakeholders, including the press, that are going to get it wrong. And if you don't step up to the plate, if you don't respond, if you don't communicate transparently, the wrong is going to get much, much worse. You seem passive. You seem like you don't care, and that's a really important thing to avoid. When the FBI was talking about the timing of letting them know what's going on with your crisis, the same thing is true from a communications perspective. If you don't get out in front, and if you're not the source of information about you, that information is going to get out there somehow. Think about how every one of us knows about Target, about Equifax. How do we know about that? Were we there? Somebody told us. And it's much better that it be they than that it be anyone else. Because people like us have to run around fixing things and correcting errors and dealing with individual reporters and dealing with individual stakeholders, and it's just a huge time-consuming nightmare. So you want to be the best source of information about you. Really good example after the BP spill. There was, they had no digital presence whatsoever about their spill for a really long time. So no social media, no dark site, no updates on their website. They were letting somebody else communicate about them. And some hacker created a false site that looked an awful lot like BP and just started spreading misinformation. And it was really, really, I don't think they ever really recovered from it. But another really good example for why you want to make sure that you're the one that's putting information out there.
Thanks, Virginia. And thank you all again for having us in. When you think about what you need to be communicating relative to a data breach or any other crisis in your company, the best place to start is what people really want to know, what their concerns are, and how you can speak to those concerns to begin to mitigate them a little bit. Let's just, think about this in terms of your own data breach. What do your stakeholders, customers, vendors, et cetera, what do they want to know about what happened? Anybody? I'm sorry, how did it affect me? That's the big one right there. What else? Okay. Yeah, has it stopped, or have you solved the problem? Have you identified it, and have you worked to solve it? Anything else that's really critically important? Who took it? Yeah, ultimately somebody will find that out. You may not know that at the beginning. Yeah. When did it start? Let's look at a few of these things. I think y'all hit most of them. What happened? How am I impacted? Am I impacted, and if so, how? What are you doing about it? Has the problem been solved? Obviously, you can't necessarily answer all these questions at the beginning, but you need to be anticipating them and working toward the ability to get those questions answered. There's probably, and that last one, has the problem been solved? There's an add-on to that, and that is, if not, when When do you expect it to be solved? When is a slippery slope? Because speculation does not necessarily help you. Some of the case studies we looked at, there were a number of examples where companies went out on a limb and made speculative comments. They estimated when the problem would be solved or when people might have access to whether or not their data was taken. They failed miserably in several cases, and I think that's something you have to be real careful about. Some of these other things you might know a little bit more about, but don't be drawn into trying to satisfy people just for the sake of satisfying them, only to find out that you didn't really do that after all. Let's talk for a minute about several keys to successful crisis communication. First of all, I think it's really important that you understand the intensity and the depth of the problem, and also the stakeholders' reaction to the problem. You've got to match your outreach, your communication with that degree of intensity. I think you also need to have a workable plan. Virginia's going to talk about how to cobble that together in a few minutes. And you've got to put yourself in your stakeholders' shoes. And it doesn't matter what we get drawn into, whether it's an oil spill, a plant explosion, an ugly train derailment, makes no difference at all. We constantly bring our clients back to this point. In the case of a data breach, your company may be victimized, but that does not make you the victim. The victims are the people whose data was stolen, and you have to have empathy and sympathy and concern for them. And I've seen way too many companies go down this path and start whining about how they were impacted. Newsflash, nobody gives a damn. They want to know how they were impacted. And that's why you constantly have to stay away from playing the victim. Other keys, understanding this should read stakeholder priorities. You've got a long list of stakeholders. We've talked about some already. You can't communicate with everybody at once. You got to figure out who you need to talk to first, and that takes pre-planning. Talk to people where they are and use the vehicles they use to communicate. What we're talking about here is enabling people to reach you in a two-way street, not just you preaching at them, but giving them the vehicles they need to hear and to communicate back to you. And then be committed to doing what it takes. Data breaches, like most crises, can be very expensive, very time-consuming propositions. You got a lot of different things here going on. If you're a big enough company, you got investors, stock prices, you got fines and penalties, attorney's fees, and so forth. Make sure you're ramping your response up to the highest degree possible. It's a lot easier to ramp up at the beginning than to ramp up in the middle. So start off strong if you need to, and you can always back down your response from there. What does successful crisis communication look like? These are some of the things we would say. Number one, it's timely, that you're responding quickly and creating the narrative for the public and your stakeholders. It's transparent. It's factual above all. It's got to be factual, even if that means you have to go a little slower. You've got to be factual with everything you say. That's not the same thing, by the way, as saying everything you know. Sometimes you need to press pause and not just run out in traffic and say everything you know or everything that you believe, but you do have to make sure that everything you say is factual and accurate. This, in part, and in fact, every slide up here, is why the attorneys need to be involved every step of the way. PR people sometimes have really good instincts, and sometimes we don't. And that's why we need the balance, why we need lawyers to keep us in check and to keep you in check so you're not going too far or saying too much. Empathy, we talked about that a little bit. Coordinated and speaking with a single voice. We strongly advocate that every organization in distress has one spokesperson. And there's a difference between a spokesperson and a voice. A voice could also be something you're using on social media. But the key is that your messages are all fully aligned and coordinated and consistent throughout. And that's often very tough to do when the bullets are flying. That's why a little pre-planning goes a long way. If I could convince you of anything on any of these slides, it would be that context matters. The minute the bell goes off, as we said a minute ago, people want to know, how does this impact me and how bad can it be? Your job is to put that in a proper perspective so that their minds don't run wild with fears that are unfounded. So being able to put this in appropriate context to control speculation and anxiety is a very critical element. Virginia, do I have another slide? I do, thank you. Some other hallmarks, I think, what we strive for when we communicate and help our clients communicate. Using all available communications vehicles. Again, we said this a minute ago. Talk to people where they are and how they communicate. At the beginning, don't write off any possibilities. News media sometimes, most of you will never have a crisis that gets in the media. We hope that's the case, but that doesn't mean it's not important and doesn't mean you don't need to communicate. Email to your customers, your vendors, website, mail, direct mail, paid ads sometimes, social media. All are tools that you should and could consider at the beginning of a crisis or really in advance of how you're going to be using them. Solution-driven. You don't communicate just for the sake of communicating. You communicate as a method, as a way to solve a problem. So everything you do, everything you say should feed neatly into being part of a solution-driven approach, and that your stakeholders will understand and recognize. I think I've said this about 13 times, provides two-way access to information. There was, I think Equifax is a really good example when they had their breach, and I'll get this wrong to an extent, but it'll speak for itself. They told Equifax customers, I guess, that they could go to a secure website and log in and get information about whether or not they had been breached. Well, they basically use that language. So people log in, they go to that separate site, they log in, and they're told they have to wait 2 days or 3 days or something to get that information. Maybe that's what the company meant. That's not what the company said, or rather that's not what people thought the company said. So they created more of a problem than they were actually solving by doing that. So if you're going to provide two-way access to information, you better be able to live up to it. And another thing here, it really takes the blame. I would change that word if I had to do this slide again and say accepts responsibility. Again, it doesn't have to be your fault to be your problem. And once it becomes your problem, you've got a responsibility to try to solve it. And part of that means stepping up to the plate and taking responsibility for it. Sometimes there's going to be a separation. It's going to be your vendor's fault or whoever's fault. And it's perfectly appropriate to address that with the guidance and the help of the legal counsel so that you're not creating a larger legal problem for yourselves. And then finally here, your plan, your thoughts, your actions need to be flexible. Situations change, and you need to be able to adjust to it. Having a plan is a really smart idea, but it shouldn't be etched in stone. It needs to be flexible to adapt to various circumstances. You're up.
How many of you all have had a crisis? And bear in mind that we're talking about train derailments, plant explosions, allegations of fraud, Me Too, 3, 4, 5 people, okay? So I'm not gonna pick you apart and ask you about your specific crises, so don't worry. And those of you who have had one but didn't raise your hands, maybe just pile on a little bit here. What ultimately got you through that crisis? Or who? Planning.
Although, as soon as it happens, you can take that plan and throw it out.
Yes and no.
You have to plan.
Yes.
I'm not saying that.
Yes.
It's a process. It's a process they have to go through. But most of the time is when it happens, but you still have to do it. If you don't do it, you won't survive.
So the right plan is highly strategic, and it's also scenario-based. And so what I think I'm hearing you say is, you're never going to anticipate the scenario that actually happens, right? But if you have a plan, and you have gone through the process of looking at various scenarios, there are elements of that plan that are going to be incredibly important to you, including having lined up your resources in advance. But that speaks very much to Greg's point about flexibility, that your plan is never going to address the exact scenario. I mean, I'll be honest, our rail clients and our oil and gas clients, we can do a much better job of anticipating what their scenarios might be, but there can be crises within crises. We had a situation where somebody tried to jump on a moving train, and the company's spokesperson, and clearly was badly maimed. It was a very bad idea. And the company spokesperson came down. We had a plan. We had a contingency plan. We had all kinds of potential scenarios for this particular client. The company spokesperson, highly trained, media-trained spokesperson, comes down from another country and gets in front of the camera and gets asked, what do you think caused this problem, this horrible accident? And the company spokesperson said 2 words that caused us to scramble for 2 weeks. And those 2 words were natural selection. Okay? So you've got a mini crisis inside of a major crisis. And when you go back to empathy and you go back to all of the things that need to be a really important part of a crisis plan, that was one we didn't anticipate, right? Anything else? This idea that you've got to throw it out the window is a really good point.
Can you speak to coordinating with the lawyers and admissions against interest and preservation of evidence and privilege?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. This speaks to the planning for a crisis, but it also speaks to being embroiled in a crisis. We feel very strongly at our agency that the lawyers lead the charge, right? I mean, any of you who are a business owner out there know that your legal liability is really the key point. The lawyers we work with agree with us that communicating properly and communicating and seeming transparent and not creating or festering any issues that might already be out there is also very important. But in terms of the actual logistics, we don't want to be involved in a crisis without a lawyer, and we want to be in lockstep with those attorneys. So that manifests itself in a lot of different ways. They're very involved in the crisis plan creation. We do a lot of work on crisis plans to begin with. They're very involved in the training that we do in advance as well. So I think Ray mentioned tabletop exercises, and I don't know if everyone knows what that means, but it's literally, they're bigger industrial sites, for example, will have actual drills. The regulators will actually walk into their office one day and say, this is a drill, here's your scenario, go. And they'll turn your day upside down, and they'll take 40 employees, and they're basically testing your plan. But tabletop drills are something that is much more voluntary, and we'll literally create a scenario and an incident based on that scenario, and we'll literally sit around a tabletop and talk through who's making the federal notifications, who's making the state notifications. Let's take a look at the legal liability and all those things, and so everybody involved in the crisis is working together. So lawyers will be involved in that. In an actual response, we want them to micromanage us. We'll write a press release, and we'll not send it out until the attorneys bless it. They look at content for digital, which is actually really a challenge. You need kind of a go digital team. You need a digital team that can move really quickly, but also manage to work really well with attorneys. We had a situation, gosh, probably a month ago, and we actually have somebody from our digital team here, one of our team leaders, if you all have questions afterwards. But no way for those of us who were on the ground dealing with the crisis, which was an explosion, to be monitoring everything that was going on online at the same time. And so we were getting fed information about what people are saying online. We even had one total nut who got thousands of views, who was spreading the fake news that the explosion was caused by a UFO. Okay, so the reason that somebody who obviously perished in the explosion couldn't be located was because the UFO came down, snatched him, and then set the platform on fire. So dealing with those kinds of issues also involves sensitivities from legal.
Could I address part of your question was about preserving documentation? One of the very first things we do when we get called into an incident of any type is talk with the legal counsel and make sure that we understand what the ground rules are and that those ground rules are being conveyed to whatever the relevant workforce is. We use a lot of caution about putting things in writing when they can be verbalized first. Everything, there are no secrets, and particularly when you head into litigation, anything that's put in writing can be damaging, can also be helpful, but you need to approach it from the perspective of whether or not it can do more harm than good. So fully understanding what the lawyers want us to convey to the workforce is probably one of those things that happens in the first hour or 2 hours of our engagement.
We also copy attorneys on everything so that there is some chain of privilege. But I think the most valid point there was that we do as much verbally as we possibly can. And we don't maintain that data after a crisis. So that gets turned over to the attorneys as well. And so that's one less place where a hack or those kinds of things could impact a potential client.
Jackie has a question.
They're definitely our most important partner. Please.
Specific to insurance with regard to your question. Let's assume that you've been a good listener and you have a standalone cyber policy and your insurer is a good actor and they're going to step up to the plate to make sure that your first-party costs are covered, you're being defended, et cetera. It's very important in an insurance relationship that we understand who they work for, right? So that counsel has an obligation, that counsel has an obligation to represent you, right? You are the end client, right? But they also have loyalties to the insurer who basically is their bread and butter, right? That's what they do. So in a crisis, it's very important, yay, if the insurance company shows up and does all of these things, absolutely take advantage of it. Presuming that you've done your homework in advance, you've got a good counsel, they're doing their job, they're walking you through these regulatory requirements, notifications, et cetera. But you need to have counsel, either in-house or preferably outside counsel that is just dedicated to you, to them, to the management of your response, to the impact on your branding, et cetera, because that privilege is different. The insurer can see everything that they see. We can argue about whether or not CCing an attorney is sufficient. It can be. But there is no argument that if I'm representing you, I'm representing you. Is that?
Thank you.
There are other elements of insurance too. I mean, especially in industrial accidents and those kinds of things, we're going to be setting up a claims hotline, for example, to manage all of that. And the attorneys need to be deeply involved in that as well. But again, putting your resources together before a crisis hits means that all of us can be talking and all of us can understand one another. We can understand company culture. We know the attorney or attorneys well, and we all understand what the end goals are. It just really helps. There's a human element there that just really can't be replicated otherwise. I mean, we've jumped into things with somebody in Norway that we've never met, but that's not ideal. And there are certain criteria that have to be met before we can respond adequately, and one of them is feeling really confident that they're well represented by a good legal team. So back to crises, what else? Is there anything else that anybody's experienced that they feel like would be a good share? I mean, clearly they're disruptive, and so the idea of all of this is to make them as manageable as possible. Mm-hmm. So putting together a good crisis plan from a communications perspective involves a lot of different things. We've talked about scenarios, and even though the gentleman in front is absolutely right that it's impossible to decide on all of the potential scenarios, the exercise of having identified those scenarios and going through how you're going to manage them is a really, really valuable exercise that does save you a lot of time and a lot of heartburn during a crisis. Having an incident command structure with clearly defined management team, something to think about now. Who is going to be chairing a crisis if it's a data breach or if it's a train derailment or whatever it happens to be? Who's in charge? And knowing that. And then, because that person's going to be on vacation, of course, who's the next person, right? And understanding who takes what role so that business can continue to be run while the crisis is being managed. And that's just something to think about now rather than later. From our point of view, of course, knowing who the designated spokesperson is and having them trained up to do a good job is also really important. And having some bench strength there too.
Can I comment on that a little bit? Yeah, when every organization's different. Some of your companies are quite large, others are quite small. But just thinking through a little bit who might be part of the crisis management team, obviously legal counsel, either in-house, perhaps in-house and out-of-house. Could need a criminal lawyer as well, depending on the circumstances. The CFO, the president or CEO of the company, your marketing people, your HR people, are all good examples of who you might want to include. And the way to approach this is thinking through who needs to be involved in the communications process. You can't talk to your employees unless you have your HR person involved, so they need to be part of the team. You can't talk to your customers unless you have your marketing team engaged. So your plan should align with who your stakeholder audiences are, and your team should align with how you're going to reach out to those stakeholders if the bell goes off.
So some of you are thinking about who your designated spokesperson might be, or spokespersons. Take a second and think about the last person you want to be your spokesperson. So this presentation isn't printed out for you all, but you can absolutely come up to us and we will provide it to you. And we would also be happy to provide you with a short presentation that you can give to your employees to explain to them why they don't want to be a spokesperson. So everybody's got their 15 minutes of fame they're looking for, but there are legal implications, there are all kinds of implications, and you want to give them an elegant way to take themselves out of that equation, because that can be just as dangerous as anything else. And if it is, for instance, a very public situation that you've got, they're going to need ways to extract themselves from situations where media is coming in and putting a microphone in their face and that kind of thing. So, yes? It's a really good question. So the question was, how do you manage your employees and their social media and those kinds of things? And there are a lot of, obviously, individual rights issues here, but having a social media policy in advance, and we've got templates for that, and along with the same warning that was given earlier that, you know, you don't want to just grab somebody's template, but it is a good place to start. So that you can share with employees what your social media policy is and why. In crisis, people's reaction is often to get online and defend the company. And what you're basically doing in that situation, if it isn't highly strategic, is you're raising it further and further up in an online search of your company, right? You're just keeping the issue going, you're keeping the dialogue going in a way that may or may not be strategic. Greg's point was you need to have two-way dialogue, but we like to create those vehicles for that dialogue to make sure that, you know, we're not going to love everything everyone says, but we want to do that in a very strategic way so that the information is coming back and forth and we're learning and we're informing.
I would also add that employees need to understand that their liability is at stake. If they're saying things or defending things that aren't true, or if they're posting information on the internet, even defending the company or whatever, they're putting themselves in a position where they're some kind of an expert and they're likely to be deposed. So I think if employees understand that and understand the fact that the policies are in place, not necessarily to muzzle them, or maybe I should say not only to muzzle them, but also to protect their liability. and to keep them out of the line of fire. I think they're a lot more willing to abide by those kind of policies.
And this goes back to the fact that we always want to make sure that we're speaking with one voice, that everybody is singing off the same hymnal, to the point that if we can be working with regulators and to appear to be cooperative and to be a team with regulators, that's one of, I think, the most useful things you can get out of a communications team or a communications plan is having those relationships in place so that it's not adversarial, because that can create a lot of public relations issues as well. I saw a question back there, yeah. So that's a really good question, and I would say treat it like a press conference. And so you're getting 10 questions at the same time. Pick the one you like and answer it. If you're not responsive at all, if you're not addressing the questions that are coming your way, that's going to be a problem in terms of what the perception is of you and as a company and of the company as a whole. So there will be patterns. And there are a lot of patterns in crises, and that's a whole nother presentation, but everyone thinks their crisis is unique, and in point of fact, there are actual cycles to almost every single crisis. But one of the patterns is that you're going to get a lot of the same questions, just asked different ways. And so the strategy there is to make sure that the questions that are being asked most frequently and that are core to the situation are, in fact, being answered in a transparent and proactive way. Another really good question, and the answer there is, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, you want to meet them where they are whenever it makes sense strategically. In some cases, NOLA.com, for example, I mean, we've actually got a NOLA.com oriented issue right now. I'm not sure that that's always the best place to jump in on the comments section. There's a reality for community meetings and for media websites that the people who have the time to focus on that are typically not well educated about the issue and extremely angry about something else. So they'll get on there and drum it up and really create issues. We will always watch those posts, and sometimes when we have third-party supporters or people who make sense or industry experts, we'll have them post because they've got credibility and that can diffuse a situation. The answer is it's highly strategic, but we definitely, that also falls into the category of things you don't want your employees doing, is jumping on there and you know, stirring the pot.
I think the main point there is flexibility. No one size fits all. If something seems to be really, really egregious or really, really damaging and catching fire, you've got to address it. Otherwise, sometimes you just need to take a deep breath and let it go. The main thing is you need to know about it. And that's the piece that's so difficult. You can build that into any plan you want, but carving out the time or designating the staff to pay attention to what's going on the internet is much more challenging than it seems on paper.
It's vital, though. I mean, it's one of the most vital things we can possibly do these days from a communications perspective, because it's where everybody's getting their information. The number of people who actively seek news and seek information is down so dramatically. And I can say this because I think I'm relatively in the same age group, and I don't see a lot of super young people here. Information gets pushed. If you're 50, you're probably still reading the newspaper or turning on a specific news show that you like, or even going to a specific website. But a lot of folks are getting information that just flashes across their phone, and they decide whether or not they're going to push on it. So knowing that and understanding that and having a team that's highly strategic, and if they see it on NOLA.com and they see that that could be an emerging issue and can then go and figure out whether it is an emerging issue, is it popping up other places, is this a common theme, that's really critical. It's the best way to nip things in the bud. So, risk assessment has been a common theme today, and it's depressing, but it's also incredibly important. Knowing where you're vulnerable is so key. This is one of my favorites, is having a sense of a timeline, and this is not necessarily something that can be built in advance, but it needs to be done on day one of a response, is how quickly are you going to be going from reactive to proactive? And that, to me, says whether or not your crisis is going to come out of it, whether you're going to emerge from your crisis successfully. As long as you are being pummeled and answering questions and dealing with it on the receiving end, it's literally making the crisis worse and worse and worse and worse. So if you can get into a mode where you're pumping information out quickly, it's your information, it's what you want out there, that is a real hallmark of success. And so we're going to talk a lot about planning as well, but another is understanding who your stakeholders are. Are they internal? Are they your employees? Are they your vendors? Are they regulators? Are they customers? Are they governmental entities? Who are your stakeholders? And when you put this together and you do this assessment, tier 2 is who thinks they're your stakeholder, right? I mean, this may not impact them in any way, but one of the things we said right off the bat was, how does this impact me? Some wise soul in the audience said, that's what people want to know. Well, it's true. And being able to address that on a global scale is really important. But prioritizing, obviously, when you're in the thick of a crisis is key, and knowing who your stakeholders are. Obviously, and we keep saying this, but you've got to have a really, really good legal team that understands all of your legal and regulatory requirements and who is able to work with the rest of the team on what their needs are. So I would argue that in crises of consequence, we usually have more than one attorney there. Communications vehicles are very unique to different companies. We had the aforementioned explosion, privately held company, no presence online whatsoever, no website, no, God forbid, no Facebook, no Twitter, none of that. Everybody who was in a position of leadership was born way before all of these things became such a priority. And convincing them that they needed to have some kind of online vehicle to be able to disseminate information was a real challenge. But then when we told them that we could shut it down afterwards, they were very relieved. But I would argue that anyone who may have a crisis needs to have all of those vehicles, and you just populate it over time with different things, employee birthdays, whatever it has to be, even if you think you don't need it, simply so that you've got that vehicle and it is something that we can use to reach out to people and get information to people. Whether or not you have a website, and again, I don't know how relevant this is. I mean, I'm talking about a private oil and gas company, for example, but you could at least have one for the event of a crisis that's dark. So if you have a website and you are a company that sells things and you are very much in positive publicity mode and making sure that everyone knows about your product and all those good things, you might be leery of putting anything that's crisis related on your website. And I would argue that that's actually really smart and really strategic. It depends on the company. You might be educating people to a crisis they're not even aware of, because they're coming to your website for something else. So again, what those vehicles are really depends on what kind of company you are and what kind of crisis you have. Does that make sense? The ability not just to monitor social and digital media and also mainstream media, but to be able to do it in real time is really, really key, because things move so incredibly quickly these days. And that leads right directly again to the idea of having a digital response team. And again, a designated spokesperson. Greg said earlier that you need to have a voice, and I just wanted to clarify that a little bit. every company that is online and every company that is engaged in social media and digital activity has a voice. It's their personality online. And that's something that we also take into account in crisis, what kind of a voice we're going to take on. It's obviously going to be authoritative and compassionate, and there are just different elements that we want to make sure that that voice has. But having a digital response team designated is vital. So we talked about a lot of different case studies today, and which ones were better than others. And Equifax, for example, I think we would all argue was a failure. Why have those kinds of companies failed? Before I throw those up there, I want to get some responses from you all, but I'll kick it off with Equifax. That was a company that really didn't have, in my opinion, an honest assessment of how they were perceived. Who likes the credit reporting companies? Huh? So they have our data, but we didn't give it to them. So there's a huge element of resentment that they've got and are profiting from our data, and then they let it get away. So that, to me, would be a critical component of a SWOT analysis if they had been our client. And add to that the fact that they didn't reveal the breach for too long, and then they didn't reveal the next 3 breaches for too long. So what are some of the other failures that companies have had, in your view, from a communications perspective? Yep, BP Oil, specifically. Okay, okay, so the Parkland shooting and the sheriff and how he presented himself. You're referring to the question of whether or not he should have gone inside and.
No, how he claimed to be the leader and the strong guy, and it's all falling apart. Made it all about him.
Which leads to a really good question. Once you're getting media scrutiny, you need to be really truthful, because they're going to figure it out really quickly if you're not. And that's impossible to recover from. So yeah, that was a huge reputational hit for that department. Right. So that's another really interesting one for those of you who didn't hear. High-profile CEOs who dump their stock before the crisis gets revealed. Not good for the company, clearly. I would argue, though, that CEO probably doesn't care at that point, and they're incredibly rich for a very short period of time before they get fined into oblivion. But it's a really, really good point. I mean, the media is going to ferret all of that out. Yeah. Not addressing a scandal that had been going on for decades, and in so doing seeming incredibly unempathetic. And when you think about half or more of the population is female, that's a real problem, right? That's a perfect example of people who think they're stakeholders. I don't even have a daughter. I'm a stakeholder in that, right? Sorry? Oh, the water crisis, Flint, absolutely, absolutely. And that went on for years and years and years. That's another thing to think about, is what are the different things that are going to reset the clock on any given crisis? A major, major crisis is going to be rehashed every single year on the anniversary of whatever it was. Flint is a great example because they just kept torturing themselves. They didn't solve the problem, and that leads to another really key element of successful crisis communications is we got to try and make the companies do the right thing for the right reasons. They've got to get it taken care of. The longer it drags out, the longer it's going to just continue to beat them over the head, and the more money they're going to lose, and the more reputational credibility they're going to lose, and the more liability they're going to have in court. Really good point. Yes. And it continues. Right, it continues. And that one, to me, it's highly local, obviously, but also the perception, and I don't know if it's a reality and I don't know if it's fair to say, but the perception is that those who remain, I mean, the obvious answer every single time from a corporate perspective is throw somebody under the bus, and then that helps you move on, right? Think about Me Too. The number of people who have had to leave their companies or who have gotten fired, or just the very, very, very quick reactions of companies. And I'm not going to comment on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I will say that it's happening more and more, that anything can come up from 20 years ago or 10 years ago or yesterday, and the pressure of the stakeholders and the perceived stakeholders creates its own end result. And I think that's really, really key, that the alacrity with which these reactions are happening is, if anything, ramping up. But it's not enough just to fire somebody. I think everybody knows that, right? So, number one, slow to acknowledge. That goes all the way back to the Exxon Valdez. The reality of that particular situation was that given the regulations at the time, they were well within normal limits in terms of what they were doing and how they were doing it, strangely enough. But they didn't talk about it for over 5 or 6 days. And it just dragged out and became a real problem. The reality is, it's just like you have an argument with your spouse. You have an argument with your best friend. It's not going to subside until they think you hear them, right? If you keep talking, it's not really going to resolve the situation. You've got to get out there early, make your statement, acknowledge the problem, and listen. So, being slow to acknowledge is a real problem. Slow to communicate, same thing. More and more, somebody else is going to jump into the fray and communicate for you, which is a real problem. So, a lack of transparency or full disclosure, a perception there. And this is where our partnership with legal comes back into play. What we tell clients is, everything you say has to be true, but you don't have to say everything all the time, right? I mean, you can't say anything that is not a fact, because it will be ferreted out. But given whatever the crisis is, we would be working with your legal team to figure out, what do you want to put out there, when and how? And again, it's just not worth trying to fudge even a little bit. Anything that's incomplete or seems incomplete promotes speculation. On the other hand, speculation is a really, really, really great tool. If you walk into any crisis knowing that you are absolutely, positively not going to speculate, you have saved yourself so much trouble. Anything you don't know to be true, don't talk about it. And then Greg already talked about this, one way only. I hate to say it, but from a communications perspective, you've got to acknowledge that you've harmed people, put people at risk. It doesn't have to say, I'm sorry, I did it, my fault, or any of those things. There are a lot of elegant ways to communicate that you care and that the company is a company worth continuing to patronize.
Yeah, we like to tell our clients, saying I'm sorry is not the same thing as saying I did it. They're not the same thing, but when you put people in a bad spot, you need to recognize that, and you need to show, we constantly urge our clients to show some humanity.
Greg already talked about context. It's so easy to get mired in a crisis and just be Chicken Little and the sky is falling and all of those different things. Put it in context in terms of your day-to-day, and put it in context in terms of your stakeholders. That's really important, and that's important as we figure out potential scenarios when we're planning and writing a plan as well. Yeah, creating an expectation for yourself in the beginning is really key, and making sure that you are living up to that expectation is really, really important, which brings us full circle again today to the idea of planning. Don't just plan before a crisis, and please do plan before a crisis, but plan during a crisis. If you don't take time outs, and you're going to feel like you're, butts on fire every single day of a crisis, but you've got to take the time to plan during a crisis and to set aside time so it doesn't get away from you. And then take time to plan after a crisis as well, Do what we call a hot wash, and that would be the same thing essentially as the tabletop, but all of the players who were critical to the crisis getting together and talking about what went well, what didn't go well, what can we learn from this, what mistakes can we avoid repeating. And that becomes an incredibly important part, too, of communicating and working on the reputational aspect of how the crisis impacted you. So, and I'm getting notice that we're close to time, and I want to give you all time to ask some questions, but creating a scenario-based plan is a key takeaway. Creating an incident command structure. And that, by the way, if it's going to be a long-term situation, think about cascading. People get burned out, people get tired. Think about, I want my life back, right? That was a comment that didn't need to be made, and maybe it wouldn't have been made if he'd had some relief. I mean, I would argue that one guy can't take that much pounding for that long on a 24-hour basis. So you've got to acknowledge that kind of thing too and create a cascading situation for every element of your crisis, not just communications. And then making sure that you have your mechanisms of communication in place. Your dedicated digital team, the live monitoring, and live being the operative word there. We need you to be monitoring moment by moment. Decide whether you're going to have a dark site or whether you're going to use your existing website as a mechanism for information. How are you going to utilize your social media platforms? And then one thing we didn't talk about earlier, but that does help, is media training in advance. You want to make any mistakes that you're going to make on camera in front of friends and learn from them, as opposed to getting thrown out there and put on camera without any training whatsoever. And that also involves message development and scenario development and those kinds of things as well. So, questions? How many people have a plan of any kind? Okay, it's not an impressive number, guys. Get to work. Thanks again, everyone. There's a lot to take care of. Okay,